Okay, we're going to be talking today about, in reference to some questions that have been asked in the past about lactic acid that was on our YouTube channels and how that affects fatigue. And, you know, really, if you go back to years past and you look at what's been brought up as what was considered at the time multiple reasons how muscle force output could drop, you always heard that what was mentioned was the lactic acid system brought heavy fatigue. Well, since that point, we've got a better understanding of what lactic acid is and how the muscle does lose its force-generating potential. So there's many factors outside of lactic acid that contribute to a muscle fatiguing. You've got the ATP-PC system, and when the PC stores reduce themselves from high-intensity effort, that brings fatigue. You've got inorganic phosphate, which is another byproduct of PC metabolism that brings fatigue. You've got glycogen content of the muscle being reduced that brings fatigue. Increased temperature, core temperature, can bring fatigue. So there's multiple factors outside of lactic acid that can contribute to muscle fatigue. But let me make one point to try to make what we know more than we've known in the past and how that involves the three energy systems. Think of anaerobic glycolysis. Think of that as the lactic acid system. And when you hear the word lactic acid, think of a byproduct of metabolism where glucose is converted to pyruvate. And pyruvate, if not oxygen is available to the muscle, causes lactic. When you hear the word acid, think of hydrogen ions backing up, meaning that the intensity of exercise is so intense that the aerobic system can't contribute much. And because the aerobic system can't contribute much, the only system that you have that can generate the power is the anaerobic system, which is the PC system and the lactic. Well, when those hydrogen ions, because of the intensity nature of the movement, running a full 40, when they back up, they cause the muscle to stop its cross-bridging. So you can almost think of it as God's way of preventing you from doing severe amount of high-intensity work continuous enough that could cause other side effects that could be destructive to the body. So when you ask somebody how fast can you run 100, you can't run 200 yards as fast as the split time of 100. The second 100 is going to be slower. What about the third 100? It's going to be slower. Well, then what about if we dominate the lactic acid system in a 90-second run and we cover this much distance in 90 seconds? Well, if you try to go 180 seconds at the same split time, it's going to be impossible. So you can see that both systems, the ATP-PC and the lactic system, if they're going to be done in a repetitive manner, you're highly dependent on the aerobic system as a strength, because that's the only other system you can go back to for recovery or the continuous nature of the high-intensity movement. Now, we've got a slide here that basically shows the three energy systems being used together. And you can see that the ATP-PC, which is this green line, you can see that this energy system turns on with human movement at maximum effort at the same time that the lactic system turns on and the aerobic system turns on. So it's real important to not think of these systems as switching from one to the next. They all turn on at the exact same time. So running a 6-second sprint involves aerobic metabolism. It doesn't involve it as much as the ATP-PC, but it still involves it. Well, what about if I do something that lasts 50 seconds of maximum effort? Well, at 50 seconds of maximum effort, you can see the PC system has just depleted itself, but it turned on at the same time that the other two did, and you see that the lactic system is involved heavily through that 50-second period, but the aerobic system is also contributing heavily at 50 seconds. Well then, what happens if we do this where we break up multiple sprints? Well, let's say I do a 6-second sprint, the average play of football. And most people would say football is an anaerobic sport. Well, it uses the anaerobic system, but it also needs the aerobic system to regenerate those PC stores. and it uses the aerobic system if short rest periods are used, like today's no huddle or high tempo football. So with all the teams running high tempo, trying to run a play every 15 seconds, you can see that whether it's 50 seconds, 6 5-second sprints, that last 30 seconds of activity, or 30 seconds of activity continuous, all three systems are going to contribute. So here's a good example. Here's a graph that shows that running a 6-second sprint, one of them, the anaerobic system and the aerobic system, this gray line is the aerobic system contributing with the anaerobic. You can see that the anaerobic system for one 6-second sprint is dominant, contributing. Now if we take a 30-second rest, which most sports today have a play clock that would be between 30 to 35 seconds, you can see even with that long rest period for a 6-second sprint, that's a 1 to 5 work to rest ratio. Well, you can see that the aerobic system on the very next sprint starts to contribute more. And then with a 30-second rest, you see that the aerobic system for the third sprint contributes more than the second. And as you do more sprints with a 30-second rest, you're using more oxygen between the sprints to be able to recover the PC stores, but you're also involving more of the aerobic system while you're doing the 6-second effort. This graph here shows that the way we know the aerobic system contributes more to repeat sprinting is the VO2 climbs after every sprint with a rest period as little as 30 seconds. Well, then what happens to the rest period if it's taken down to 15 seconds? It makes the aerobic system contribute even more. Now, you'll see that your best sprint effort declines when you take rest periods this short. This is another way of knowing that the aerobic system is contributing more. Because if you can run a 6-second sprint and cover this much distance, but you start to see less distance on every 6-second sprint afterwards, it's because the anaerobic system can't keep up with the demand. You're doing too many continuous sprints that you're dependent on the aerobic system. And today, at the highest level, even at the Division I level, you don't see a lot of aerobic strength being trained year-round. So we don't need to make them marathon runners, but they have to have an optimum. And like football, you want the skill guys to be around 55 milliliters at the VO2 testing. That means if they can test out at 55, you're going to have a tailback or a safety that will be able to do multiple sprints without a severe decline in power. If you got one that's in the 30s, he's going to have maybe great anaerobic capability by what we've done year-round, but when he goes to do it continuous, by the fourth quarter, he's going to have a severe fatigue index that inhibits his ability to generate high power. And it's only because the aerobic system wasn't trained as a strength. Now another graph here shows that even with a 3-second sprint, all three energy systems are involved. So you got the stored ATP that's stored in the muscle and contributes 10% to a 3-second sprint. You've got the PC system, 55% of the energy, which is still, that's the anaerobic energy system, a high energy currency that's used for dunking a basketball, for running a high intensity sprint. And you see anaerobic glycolysis, which is again the lactic acid system, contributes 32%. Look how the aerobic system contributes, but very minimum, because it's a very minimum effort at maximum effort. It's 3 seconds long. The aerobic system's turned on, but it can't contribute much because of the short nature. Now, how does all this change? All right, well, let's look at a duration of a sprint, 6 seconds. Now, one 6-second sprint, look how the PC contributes, PC is the yellow, 46%, and look how the glycolysis contributes 40%. So, I mean, they're almost equal in the way they contribute to one 6-second sprint. Both of these anaerobic. Look how the aerobic system, which is the green, contributes 8% to that one 6-second sprint. Now, with a 30-second rest, which is an average play clock, look how by the time you run 10 of them, 10 6-second sprints, look how the PC system still contributes the most for the anaerobic. But look how the lactic system, which here on the first one was 40% contributing, look how by the 10th sprint it's inhibited itself to only be 9%. So what that's telling us is the aerobic system, which in a lot of places today, high school and college, and with the tempos that are being expected to be played, they're not training that energy system for development, not in the best manner. Okay? So if the aerobic system contributes that much, we've got to ask ourselves, with multiple sprints and the aerobic system contributing more, what can we do to give us the ability to be competitive? And this is a graph that basically shows fatigue in multiple sprints. Look how the peak power that you could run the first 6-second sprint, look how it drops 33% by the time you run 10 of them if it's only a 30-second rest. So you can't get around it. From your fastest 40-yard dash man to your slowest 40-yard dash man, when they run 10 in a row with a 30-second rest or shorter, they're all going to decline in speed. Because once you make the aerobic system start to predominate, power from the anaerobic system is going to come down. But what happens if you've got an underdeveloped aerobic system? When now you've got to draw on it, you don't have nothing to draw on. Your PC and ATP system's been depleted. Lactic acid, the hydrogen backup ions from working it in a high intense manner, which just comes with the territory, is starting to bring fatigue, and you're losing the ability to use those powerful motor units, and you only have one other factor you can draw back on, which is the aerobic system, which you didn't train. So we can see when you run 5-6-second sprints, it's a significant drop in power if it's only a 30-second rest. So with a 30-second rest, you can think most play drives in football could last every bit 10 to 12 plays a drive. Well, after 5 of them, even with the 30-second rest, we could see people's power production severely reduced, especially if they haven't developed the aerobic system for recovery. Now, look how after the peak power by sprint 5 reduced, look how from sprint 1 to sprint 5 is where you showed the most lactic accumulation. If you look from 5 to 10, there was a reduction in power, but not at the same rate of lactic accumulation. In fact, the rate of lactic accumulation from 5 to 10, whereas nowhere is as great, is from 1 to 5. What this tells us is, just like in this graph here, the lactic system inhibits itself. It went from 40% contributing on the first sprint to 9% contributing. And that drop-off comes from the hydrogen ions backing up. It's almost God's way of preventing, again, more excessive muscle damage from repetitive work. So if it forces you to slow down, how much does it force you to slow down? That has to do with where your VO2 is. Is your VO2 60? Or is your VO2 40? Or is your VO2 20? And if you've got a very underdeveloped VO2, then whatever power you can generate from working the anaerobic energy system, it'll be useless in a game activity that has a 12-minute quarter, because you're going to be asked to repeat that power multiple times. You can see in the graph to where from the first sprint, the lactic system was contributing 40%. When you get to the last sprint, which was the 10th one, it was only contributing to 9%. And the aerobic system jumped from 8% contributing to 40%. This reduction in the lactic acid system contributing to the last sprint comes from this system inhibiting itself. That means once you work to a point of lactic acid accumulation, the lactic acid system, the more you try to work it without complete recovery, it inhibits itself, and the only other system you can rely on is the aerobic. Now here's a perfect example. Look how a 30-second sprint, all out, uses the PC system, the lactic system, and the aerobic during the first 6 seconds. Then from 6 seconds to 15 seconds, you can see the PC system depletes itself more. The lactic system contributes more, with the aerobic system contributing more. When you go from 15 to 30 seconds, you see the PC is contributing the least, with the lactic now starting to be reduced, and the aerobic system contributing more. That's just one 30-second all-out activity. Now, if you took a 4-minute rest, which is a 1 to 8, 30 seconds of work, 8 times 30 seconds would give us 4 minutes. Even with a 4-minute rest, when you went to do the next 30-second sprint, look how the PC contributes heavily, just like it contributed heavily here, but look how the lactic system inhibits itself. Even in the first 6 seconds, it's not contributing like it did over here, even with a 4-minute rest. You can see the aerobic system, even with a 4-minute rest, contributes more on that 6-second effort than here. Look at from 5 to 15 how the lactic system inhibits itself even more as the reduction of the PC and more the aerobic. And then you can see again the use of the lactic system is severely reduced compared to the first 30 seconds. Now this is no different as in 10 6-second sprints with a short rest period. So the shorter the rest period, that's the key here. 10 6-second sprints with a 60-second rest, that's a 1 to 10 work to rest ratio. Well, 1 to 10, it's not much drop off in power. You can see the power being generated from the first one to the last one is identical. But take that down to 30 seconds, and now it all changes. With that short of a rest period, with a 6-second sprint, power comes down because you're making yourself more dependent on the aerobic system by having this short rest. Well, then what happens if we take it down to a 15-second rest? This power production would come down even more. How much would it come down by what your VO2 is? If your VO2 is too low, it's going to drastically come down. So you might have a coach questioning a tailback that's got a 4.440 that by the time he gets to the fourth quarter, he ain't running but a 4.9. It's not because of his anaerobic system being underdeveloped. It's his aerobic system. So rather than question his character, let's question on how can we develop that system as a strength. So when he has to do what he's got God-given ability to do, he can do it for 4 quarters.
So for an athlete like a basketball player or a football player or an MMA fighter or even a triathlon athlete, how does this practically apply to them, and how does that relate to them?
Well,
as far as the undertrained aerobic system.
Very good question. How this applies, an example would be VCU that runs the Havoc. So VCU prides itself on wearing teams down. And VCU, for the last 2 years, they've been implementing VO2 testing, and the VO2 testing was to give out exercise prescription off data to the individual, where VCU wouldn't overtrain the athlete or undertrain the athlete. And then with that developed aerobic system, an athlete that has the potential for high power can now use his nervous system and his anaerobic system to get the muscles recruited for that high power activity, but at the same time have an optimum enough aerobic strength to play the game 4 quarters the way Coach Smart teaches the game to be played.
So using the basketball example, then you could have a marathon runner who runs a 5.5 minute mile, but he might not necessarily be he might not necessarily be the fastest sprinter. So when it comes to, for example, VCU, with their up and down the court offense and defense, especially if they're going into overtime or 2 overtimes, training the aerobic system will help sustain that and help prolong their energy. Is that correct?
You've got it. So having an athlete that has the vertical leap of 38 inches and having a quick first step that can drive to the basket with power, that can beat people to the basket, obviously that's what Coach Roos, the strength coach at VCU, is working on, and he's working on the aerobic system for fast recovery, which allows VCU to take these high-powered athletes and be able to run the floor up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down, and have the ability to when the draw has to come on the aerobic system because of the nature of the race pace, the nature of the tempo, you're asking your body to have to fall back on the aerobic system. They're developed. They're not just thinking of sports in an anaerobic sense to where we know we need to have that to be competitive. The marathon runner no matter how much aerobic strength, running a 5-minute mile for 26 miles, that's an extreme level of aerobic strength, he still couldn't compete in their sport because he don't have the power output. He can't jump at 20 inches. His vertical jump is 20 inches. So he's got extreme ability to display aerobic strength, but he doesn't have their anaerobic capabilities. Well, we don't want to swing it the other way to where we push a tempo, and we see this constantly in football, where coaches are pushing tempos that are exceeding their football players' aerobic strength. If you ask how much time are you spending on the aerobic system as a strength, it's zero. It's all weight room, it's all speed work, it's all things necessary because that's the way the game's played. But just like you said, the boxer, to go 15 rounds, he has to develop his aerobic system through road work. He's not developing his aerobic system through sparring. He's doing things that can put more demand on the aerobic system, that can drive up VO2 to create physiological changes. So when he has to go repeat rounds, he has the ability to display high power in a repetitive manner.
And for somebody who's trying to develop the aerobic system, an individual can't really just get on a bike or get on a treadmill or get out on the street and start running. I mean, sure, they might see results, but there's specific measures that that science has been able to prove in as far as training certain energy systems, specifically in this case the aerobic system.
Exactly. So just like we said earlier, if the 3 energy systems are all turned on at the same time in human movement, well, to do an endurance event, one of the biggest drawbacks is people in group training classes trying to keep up to somebody else's steady rate that's superior. And we see coaching where the people who can't keep up are over-motivated. You can do it, you can do it, you can do it. But the truth is they can't do it. So what makes more sense is testing their capabilities and putting training programs that are based on keep them under the lactic threshold, so when they push themselves, they can push themselves to a point where a certain amount of steady rate metabolism can be maintained. And what science tells us, it's not just about training at VO2, or what we call peak VO2, which is right at under where lactic acid accumulates, but it's training where you can sustain that. You can build the intervals to go from low intervals to high intervals, and with that comes increased production of mitochondria development. And like we've said in numerous videos, increasing mitochondria development is what controls all human metabolism and has a big factor to whether fatigue sets in. So to be able to regenerate PC in a sprint, to run a sprint and use up the PC stores, you're dependent on the mitochondria for replenishment. Well, suppose I've got an underdeveloped aerobic system, then your next sprint is going to suffer with loss of power. And the more sprints you run without being able to depend on the aerobic system for recovery, the worse the sprinting is going to become, not because the brain can't activate the fiber, but you ain't got the gasoline in the tank to be able to do it because you got an underdeveloped aerobic system.
Got it. Anything else?
No, I just want to again thank all the viewers for the calls, and thank you, Nate, for what an excellent job you do putting all this together where people can understand it.
All right.